As Nigeria marks 25 years of unbroken democracy this week, how much is the message being amplified that the resourcefulness of its people has been stretched to the absolute stunning limit as they confront this country's worst economic crisis in a generation? Add to this the perception that the government is at best unresponsive, and you can see why people feel that after a quarter of a century, democracy, rather than fill them with hope and optimism, is undermining their aspirations and testing the strength and resilience of their democratic institutions. And as they watch President Tinubu, who likes to style himself as the reforming president, insist on tough medicine to deal with this country's economic chaos, they wonder, why isn't he persuading his fellow politicians and senior officials to take that medicine? He tells the people in his Democracy Day speech that he feels their pain and will not abandon them, but in their minds, his reforms are attacking and punishing the people, while government officials and senior politicians continue to live large. So, after 25 years of democracy, is Nigeria reordering itself in a quite menacing way? I'll be joined in the studio by a panel of top-notch analysts who will explore what democracy means in Nigeria today. I'm Charles Enyegolu, and this is Arise Primetime. So, the last quarter of a century culminating in this week's Democracy Day reflections as millions scan the democratic horizon with a growing sense of foreboding amid the destabilizing impact of this country's escalating economic crisis. Millions searching for the elusive dividends of democracy, many revolting against and revolted by the obscene benefits that continue to accrue to this country's politicians in the midst of so much suffering. The streets of parts of Nigeria's commercial city, Lagos, were engulfed in serious protests against Mr. Tinubu's reforms and the resulting spiral of economic misery, so many living below the poverty line. So, after a quarter of a century of democracy, the pain is widespread and the facts are depressing. 2 years ago, Nigeria was Africa's biggest economy, but this year the country is projected to drop to 4th place as Nigerians continue to generate their own electricity, source their own water, arm themselves to defend their own communities, and negotiate with kidnappers when family members are abducted. So how much worse could it get?
5 years of uninterrupted democracy, and to me it means a lot. Democracy ordinarily supposed to be government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And we want to see that in full display. So today, I will proudly say democracy is growing, though it's not growing the way it's supposed to grow. But then we want to thank God Almighty for the kind of leadership that we're having, especially in Plateau State. We have someone who is trying his best to see that he works in the best interest of the people.
For the past years, I would say we've experienced democracy in the aspect of freedom of speech, projects, development, and other things.
Knowledge about democracy. The freedom I enjoy today, it is the benefit of democracy.
Let there be an opportunity where the umpire, being the INEC, will be independent, free to conduct free and fair elections. With this, you see credible candidates will emerge winners in election, and that will in return make them to work hard to satisfy the people.
Well, let's begin our assessment of those 25 years of unbroken democracy in Nigeria. And with me in the studio to do that, our panel of experts, the political analyst and executive director of Development Specs Academy, Professor Oke Ikechukwu, who's a member of the editorial board of This Day newspaper and is also a professor of strategic management and human capital development. The policy strategist and group CEO of the global investment and trade company, Baba Yusuf, who is in our off-site studio, and the current affairs analyst and dean of the School of Postgraduate Studies at Bayes University, Abuja, Professor Abiodun Adeniyi. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And let me come to you first, Professor Oke Ikechukwu. Of course, it's not just 25 years of unbroken democracy, it's also June 12th, which is the anniversary of the 1993 ballot, considered the freest and fairest election in Nigeria's history. So it's a day that's become a symbol of this country's democratic aspirations.
Yes, that is true. On June 12, Nigerians went out to vote. The two candidates contesting were both Muslim candidates. Nobody paid attention to that. So if somebody was to speak, were to speak with a sense of history, it marked the day when Nigerians voted as Nigerians for a man they believed represented their best interests. Unfortunately, that election was annulled. And if you recall, it took quite a lot of struggle and protest. The most informed, the most patriotic, the most devoted Nigerians, some of us then, younger than we are now. I was at that time on the editorial board of The Guardian. We wrote, there were riots, among other things. The point to note is that not only did June 12th mark a major indication that Nigerians are capable of being objective in their voting, it also laid the foundation for a precipitous decline in patriotism, in national cohesion and national integration, because with the decay of that victory, cannibalized by the elite and not the people who voted, faith in the Nigerian state declined, faith in those who were behind it declined. It began with a lot of people saying on June 12 we stand, very respected individuals. After a while, it turned out that on June 12 they sat instead of standing. Eventually on June 12 they began to feed, because they were then settled and given positions, and all of a sudden they were speaking in tongues. So that was something. And anybody who wants to reciprocate June 12 should go and check the profile of Abiola, who won that election. He was known all over the country. There sadly was a Muslim, but in the most remote communities, you find that he contributes to the building of churches, to the welfare of people, etc. So that's that. That marked a period. We lost that opportunity and spiraled downwards. Now, coming to 25 years after that, some of the commentators say that democracy is for the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Some would say that no, you see, it's not government of the people in Nigeria, but I disagree. If you look at the inception of this democracy from inception in 1999, and you look at the cost of forms, that's what do you call it now? If you want to contest, you pay for a form and collect. Who can afford it? Only the elite. Who can be around those who will contest? Only the elite. So it is actually correct to say it is government of the people. But most of the time of the people who can pay. Then for the people who can also pay, and in the interest of those who can pay. You made a reference in your opening remarks to the entitlements and privileges of those in public office. You can say they are not Nigerians. They are people who are feeding fat on the people, so they are benefiting from democracy. It's a government of the people who are part of a national conspiracy, who are having a good time at the expense of everyone else. So the question of definition of people is central to the perception of the kind of democracy we are having. Right. And is it their fault? You come to me, elections are about to take place, you give me 5,000 and I vote for you. I have sold my life up front, which means for the next 4 years, I am worth 1,250 naira. I've already collected the money up front. So you see that by the kind of electoral behavior we exhibit, we also sold off our right to demand accountability up front. So put June 12 on one side, the best of what we could demonstrate as Nigerians, speaking with one voice. 25 years of democracy, progressive deterioration at two levels. At the level of the fundamentals of democracy, which is democratic values, and at the level of incidentals of democracy, which is material welfare, security, etc.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And Professor Adeniyi, just keeping in mind what Professor Ikechukwu was saying there, that there is a sense that voter choice, which is the essence of democratic elections, is slowly, steadily, in fact, ebbing away. What are the signs that you're seeing in Nigeria, positive and negative, after 25 years of unbroken democracy?
Okay, well, I think it's okay for us to first of all put things in context, at least from our point of view. First, 25 years is not a joke, something that deserves some level of celebration, which we have been in for the past 48 hours, so to say. Yeah, but beyond that, we also have to realize that democracy comes with some sides. One, sometimes we want to look at the tangible benefits, sometimes we also think about the intangible. When we talk about the tangible, we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about utilities. The most talked about dividends of democracy that we often mouth. But beyond the physical, tangible benefits, which can also come through any other form of government, be it the military, dictatorial, theocratic states, or such other types of government, is also the need for us to be mindful of the intangible, which is the values, enshrined in democracy itself. And what are these values? We're talking about freedom of speech, freedom of expression. We're talking about inclusion, integration, representation. And of course, those values, are things that we need to focus on, which makes a difference, between democracy and other forms of government. But to what extent will we now say that 25 years down the line, we've been able to achieve those other values, ingrained in democracy, which is not in other forms of government? I would say that yes, we've done well in terms 25 years down the line, in terms of longevity, but in terms of content and character of these values and the development, the evolution of this value, we will say we still have miles to cover. And of course, how do we make amends? What do we do to cover those miles? Well, we have to engender credibility, integrity in the electoral process, and beyond that, we have to ensure there is an increased inclusion, and who are those that are excluded? Of course, women are still excluded, and of course, the vulnerable are still excluded as well. And of course, what about those who do not have the means, those who are not empowered, so to say, those who are excluded from the race on account of their poor or low war chest? How do we create the enabling environment so that we can have increased representation? I beg your pardon. Then what about disenfranchisement? During voting, violence, and such other things that seems to dent the credibility of the electioneering process, which is an important integral part of democracy itself, as the case could be. So we need to focus on these things, and of course, if we focus on them, then we can begin to increase our level of celebration beyond just talking about democracy, in a vacuum, as the case could be.
Okay, thanks for that, Prof. Let me come to you, Baba Yusuf. I'm afraid we've marooned you in our off-site studio, which is not usual, but thank you very much indeed for joining us. I hope you were able to hear the conversation, the discussion taking place. What is your sense of the intricacies and the tensions that have come up in those 25 years?
It's a bittersweet moment for us in Nigeria. Like the two professors mentioned, the build-up to democracy and the sacrifices made by the vanguards. But looking on the past 25 years to say, how have we fared? I totally agree, recognizing the intangible values of freedom of expression, of association. But more importantly, I consider democracy a process that should churn out, products, if you like, or dividends. And what are those dividends? Justice, equity, good economics, social economics, and also a sense of belonging by all. Have we achieved that? No. If you look at the indices, when the Fourth Republic started in 1999, and look at the indices now, you will see with nostalgia how bad things have become. Interestingly, 1999 was when the military, handed over to the Fourth Republic. So if we are doing an evaluation and we dimension the issues, while we say we are looking forward to better governance during the Fourth Republic from 1999, we have rather been marooned, to borrow your words, Charles, to the roadblocks that I call roadblocks of insecurity, bad socio-economics, and all the indices that have gone negative going forward. Of course, if I go back as also to reflect on the good side, we have had successful transition from an administration that had over to government in power. And interestingly, we have also seen where an incumbent at national and subnational have been upstaged by opposition parties or coalition of political parties. So I will say in that regard, the polity is evolving, our democracy is evolving, but I believe also we should have done better in the past 25 years. The political class have failed. But to add to what Professor Oke said, I totally agree. But to expand that conversation, like I always say, we, the elites, and in this case, not just the political class, have been serially failing Nigerians because we have been part of the value chain of leadership. And of course, like I say many times in my write-ups, we have been part of the corruption value chain. We enable the politicians to do what they have been doing to us, either as security agents or as public servants or civil servants. And going forward, we should expand the conversation to stop only looking at the political leaders, to also include the quote-unquote elites that are sitting, in the civil service, public service, enabling corruption, supporting what has been going on while the country is going backwards, and then we can sit down comfortably and continue pointing at quote-unquote the political class. Going forward, that conversation should expand, and we should take part of the responsibility of the failures we have been experienced thus far.
Well, thank you for that, Baba Yusuf. We'll come back to you in a hot second, but let me come to you, Professor Oke Ikechukwu, because, of course, as a professor, you talk to a lot of people, students, as well as board members. I mean, you're a member of the board of this day newspaper, so you kind of cross various lines and so on. I mean, as you reflect on those 25 years of unbroken democracy, what would you say is taking up the bandwidth of concern in this country at the moment?
What's taking up and creating a lot of concern is the growing perception of elite insensitivity and elite irresponsibility. And in the midst of all of that, you find that the incumbent government is being blamed for things that took more than a decade to mature. So people are responding to the present, and not enough of the people reacting have the sophistication to view the issues with a sense of history. And I'll just take a simple matter. You speak of dividends of democracy. Let's talk about roads. Between 1999 and when was it the PDP had made over? 2015. Now the road from Abuja to Kaduna, which is ordinarily a 1.5 hour trip, you'll do it for 3 hours. That road was bad for the 8 years the government was in power. If you're going from here to Lokoja, sections of that road was bad. If you're going beyond Lokoja from Ajokuta to Ayamba, the road was bad throughout that period. If you take Makodi or Topa, wherever, the roads were bad. If you say, okay, no, let me go to the east, let me do Port Harcourt Enugu Expressway, sections were bad throughout. Onitsha, Enugu, the same thing, Okene Road, Ikotekpene, all over the Federation. For 16 years, those roads were bad. For the 8 years of Buhari, most of them were still bad. As we speak, they have not. And these were things budgeted for. So when we are saying, oh, we're angry with the government, let us also know that the correct statement is we're angry with the ruling elite. And we can't pin everything down on a government of the day. Having said that, and having chosen that example, those things stand out. But we must also admit that in the midst of all of this, even if it's only one person, there are a few people in public office, either as governors, as senators, as members of the House of Representatives of House of Assembly, who are doing their best to set good example. They are a minority, but we can't pretend they don't exist. Now, what creates a problem for all of them as a group is that with the increase in poverty, suffering, and insecurity, the visible comfort and luxury of those in public office has an offensive smell in the public nostril. I mean, we knew about 160 million vehicles to secure them because of criminality all over the place. We see checkpoints everywhere. We hear of soldiers being killed. The first one was the Niger State one. A plane, I think, was shot down carrying 20 officers, if my figures are correct. These are not chicken dying on the road. These are people who took the country a lot of expense. They are the core professionals. If anything were to happen in the US today, the inner state emerges, which is the military and the security agencies, and restore order and then move back again. Do we have an inner state? We have, by civilian misconduct, comprehensively stigmatized those who actually stand to defend the territorial integrity of Nigeria. So in the last 20, 25 years, what has happened is that civilian administrative incompetence has created for the military job they don't need to be doing. Manning checkpoints. A soldier is trained to take down an object. He's not trained to arrest anybody and detain him. Now we are demobilizing our soldiers by putting them in places. You say, oh, insurgents have surrendered. We are de-radicalizing them. Soldiers, that's on one side. At another level, you have the numbers are thinning. They are not being sufficiently replenished. So if you put it all together,
right,
you would say, no, it is not looking good.
Okay.
But the solution is not to go around saying bad things about your country. Positive suggestions. There are things that can be done differently, and I hope we'll get to that point eventually.
Right. Okay. Let me come to you, Professor Adeniyi. Let's talk a little bit about living standards in those 25 years, because I think Professor Okeke touched on that. Living standards are supposed to be part of the dividends of democracy. Have they stalemated or improved in the quarter of a century?
But, you know, we've made a point, you know, that if it was just a question of living standard, a physical aspect of the benefit of democracy, then of course we may not necessarily associate it with democratic dispensation alone. But be that as it may, we also know that if you look at it critically, it's been declining, you know, and of course it has plummeted even in the last 1 year on account of, you know, the reforms of the new administration. The liberalization of, you know, the removal of subsidy on fuel, removal of subsidy on foreign exchange, removal of subsidy on the ban of electricity. Of course, this has created shock. You know, yes, we know the government is trying, said they're concerned about, you know, bringing about the interplay of market forces. Market forces is fine, you know, for a quasi-capitalist state like Nigeria. It's in order, but we also know that we don't have the structures and institutions to withstand unbridled forces of the market, and that's why we're having this momentary, emergent, you know, devastating decline in the standard of living of the people. But where the hope lies is just in the pronouncement or the projection of economists that, of course, when you have this kind of reform, you can only hope that in another 2 or 3 years there will be improvement. But again, I will insist that we may not necessarily associate it with democratic dispensation. This kind of reform can also come in any other kind of administration. Of course, we once had it. There was a time in this country where we had the structural adjustment policy, and we knew what it did to us, what it did to our economy. And so sometimes arguments arrive, you know, that of course our economy started declining from the introduction of SAP in this country, sometimes in the 80s, in the period of President Ibrahim Babangida. So, but the point we need to also emphasize is that, yes, we know, the point has been made severally that democracy is not necessarily a destination, but a journey. And of course, for you to deal with democracy, you have to continue to be democratic. And of course, it's a journey that is continuous, can hardly be perfect. All the time we cite the example of the United States of America as the bastion of democracy. We know that, you know, 1776, they started 1776, more than 2 centuries after, they are still struggling with some aspects of it. Yes, we know the institutions are strong, but there are still reasons for them to try to aspire to perfection. If we want to talk about the best democracies in the world, we keep talking about it. The Nordic Scandinavian countries will take it, you know. But again, that does not mean they are also still perfect. Our own limitation rests in the fact of what we keep talking about, which is leadership, you know. And how do we change the narrative around leadership? We need leadership, you know, that will match words with action, leadership that will walk their talk, leadership that will present the right optics so that the people can be galvanized in the right direction, you know. And when point A is made and we see action reflected in point B, it becomes problematic. You know, you see deviation. And of course, you know, people find it difficult to fall in line with in the direction in which the leaders want to lead them. I think it's about discipline, it's about re-engineering our values, it's about commitment, and it's about a determination to leave legacies. Legacies cannot just be left in physical infrastructure alone. It can be left, yes, in patterns and particularities, peculiarities of leadership. Behavior pattern of the leaders, such that we can have long-lasting example that people can imbibe, abide by, and change the course of things.
Well, thank you, Prof. Although I have to point out that it sounds like a broken record, because I mean, although the points you're making are very salient, but those same points have been made at different times in those 25 years and beyond. And as Professor Okechukwu was saying, the roads are still bad, and they're still it's a rather depressing
and
story.
Because the problem is still there, we'll still have to continue to make the points until
I
they are
agree.
remedied, as a case could be.
But I think we should be much harder and in making those points, especially to the people who've been charged and who have consistently failed to do what they're supposed to do. But we'll talk more about that. We'll come back to you, Baba Yusuf, but we do have to take a break. You're watching Arise Prime Time. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our discussion about what democracy means in Nigeria today. Stay with us. Welcome back to Arise Prime Time, where we offer perspectives on the news and talking points of the day. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Now, as Nigeria marks 25 years of unbroken democracy this week, how much is the message being amplified that the resourcefulness of its people has been stretched to the absolute limit? As they confront this country's worst economic crisis in a generation, the perception appears to be that the government is unresponsive. And you can see why people feel that after a quarter of a century, democracy, rather than fill them with hope and optimism, is undermining their aspirations and testing the strength and resilience of their democratic institutions. And as they watch President Tinubu, who likes to style himself as a reforming president, insist on tough medicine to deal with this country's economic chaos, they wonder, why isn't he persuading his fellow politicians and senior officials to take that medicine? He tells the people in his Democracy Day speech that he feels their pain and will not abandon them, but in their minds his reforms are attacking and punishing the people, while government officials and senior politicians continue to consume conspicuously. And with me in the studio as we continue our assessment of 25 years of unbroken democracy in this country, our panel of expert commentators, the political analyst and executive director of Development Specs Academy, Professor Okechukwu, who's a member of the editorial board of This Day newspaper and is also a professor of strategic management and human capital development, the policy strategist and group CEO of the global investment and trade company Baba Yusuf, and the current affairs analyst and dean of the School of Postgraduate Studies at Bayes University in Abuja, Professor Abiodun Adeniyi. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And let me come to you, Baba Yusuf, because we had to take a break and we couldn't come to you earlier. We've been talking about the politicians, and I'm wondering what, if anything, are they doing to improve matters in this country as the wound keeps bleeding, as it were? Is there a credible plan that you see for getting Nigeria growing again, or is the planning system itself appallingly sclerotic?
Thank you very much for landing on that planning, and to add to that, strategy. We take a step back to look at the current administration. A lot of missteps, a lot of reversals of decisions, a lot of cross-purposes actions and policies that are in complete parallel to the renewed hope manifesto of President Tinubu and his reiteration of ensuring that he delivers his mandate. In my strong opinion, the fundamental issue is lack of thoroughly thought out strategic blueprints that would drive the agenda of this administration. You hear a lot of our policies. I dare say that policies are supposed to be, derived from an overarching strategy, and all the other sectorial drivers should derive their strategies from an overarching strategy to ensure there will be policy coordination, there will be policy coherence, and there will be practicality in what they do. I see a lot of living in a bubble kind of policies churned up by this administration, with due respect. But of course, it is not the sole fault of this administration. It has been the bane of our development, Charles. We've had a lot of cases where we have some national development plans or some strategies that have been, crafted, and then they end up gathering dust somewhere. There is no sure-footedness in following through with those strategies or reviewing them or measuring performance. With regards to the Tinubu's administration, he set up a performance matrix for this administration, and I think there is need for them as a matter of urgency, if they don't have an overarching strategy, to ensure they have one. Unless you have a strategy in this kind of crisis, you can't go into battle without strategy. And you must be sure that you have a blueprint with a roadmap that will take us to where you say you're going to take us. What I see is silo activities by ministers. If you take, for example, even from the performance reviews that have taken place last week, you see self-appraisals and you don't see connectivities established by these sectors to show us that they are really, working in a way and manner that they are all moving in a direction that is based on a strategy. So like you said, a lack of a purposefully thought out plan. And you can see it playing out with the removal of the oil subsidy and the outcomes and the impacts, as they are unfolding. I dare say, if things are not done, drastically to change this, things are going to get worse. So the first step, recognizing the 1 year in office of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, is to go back and sit on the drawing board real quick, 2 days, 3 days, to come up with ways forward. Because the indices on one side may tell us projections. I am a student of strategy, and I believe performance, like I always say in this studio and elsewhere, should be measured by impacts and outcomes and not by events. And therefore, going forward, they need to go back to the drawing board to ensure that. The recruitment process also is very important, Charles. If you don't have round pegs and round holes, what happens is they take you back, decades behind in delivering what you promise people. And what that does to the entire process is you have 1 or 2 weak links that will bring down the entire house and the entire administration. So it is very critical that going forward we have that. We heard about the $1 trillion economy. How is that going to happen if you don't have a blueprint that will drive that delivery? But before the $1 trillion economy, we have insecurity, we have the socio-economic vagaries hitting us. What are the short-term interventions, with regards to this, rather than the bric-a-brac and running into each other policies that we are seeing that are countermanding the mantra, going forward?
To you, Professor Okechukwu, let's just move the conversation back to the issue of the evolution of democracy. I think what worries people the most is that Nigerian democracy still appears to be a wounded beast after 25 straight years. I mean, you would have thought that the healing and recovery process would be well underway after the reforms that led to Goodluck Jonathan being removed as incumbent president for the first time in Nigeria's history. But we're still talking about ballot box snatching. Somebody was making that point here. Election results being written and manipulated by the most unsavory characters imaginable, who then become politically elected people. And there's that fundamental lack of trust in the election process. So that's absolutely inexcusable, or should be, after 25 years of democracy.
Well, we can only say it's inexcusable if the people's political maturity has moved up in 25 years. Democracy and the practice of democracy is, first of all, a state of consciousness. I know that my decision will determine whether Charles will be in charge of this studio. And I know Charles is the best. But there's this person who smokes in the studio, does a lot of other things, and he buys us drinks. and we make him head of the studio. So first of all, whereas it's true we can complain about the elite, there's a fundamental point to make about the quality of political followership, the level of political consciousness, the dissociation between political decisions and political outcomes and economic outcomes. Now, if you bring out somebody, let's suppose Biodun here goes to contest in his village, in his community, he wants to run for House of Assembly, he's a professor. Apparently, he's had the experience that will probably, not because he's a professor, because I must make that distinction. People make the unfortunate mistake of assuming that once you call somebody a professor that he's competent, most of the time he only has information about a particular discipline with no experience whatever. He can tell you everything there is about it, and you mistake that for capacity to govern. But in his own case, here is somebody, he has the information, he has the knowledge as practical, he can actually do proper administration. And he goes to his people and tells them how he can transform their lives in 2 out of 4 years, but that he'll be there for 4 years. I say, did you bring anything for us? He says, no, we're looking. They go to elect a scoundrel. Now, it's easy for us to stand and analyze the misfortune of the quality of elite leadership. We're not paying attention that the very best will not find encouraged. So what type of soil do we have? Charles, this soil is not mature enough for the kind of leadership we're talking about.
Well, that may not be a fair thing to say.
No. I'm advancing the point further.
Because a lot of the people, those people have been impoverished as a result of the action. There's nowhere in the world where people don't live, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they don't live to survive if they have to live to survive. Live that way.
But I was advancing the point
further.
Okay. Now, that's the quality of followership you have. In that same environment, you bring a leader who sets totally new paradigms, refuses to succumb to the usual pressures. They ask him for money. He says, no. If I give you this money, there won't be anything for others or for things to govern with. So you see that, yes, the quality of followership is terrible. The level of political consciousness is low. But leadership is the litmus, the catalyst that brings a new level of consciousness. So the crisis is not that we're having terrible democracy. It's the fact that the people's level of consciousness, which is low, is not being aided to move up. Right. You are a father in your house, you have a lot of children that are demanding for sweet and ice cream. You know it's not good for their health. You abolish it. But you can make the concession and give it to them. In a short while, they will all be sick. Now, that's what we are having. Predominant leadership that lacks the knowledge of what it means to speak of development. Development is not about roads, it's about the human person. And a leader that invests in school buildings but not in teachers, that will announce how much is spent on education but not indicate better outcomes in learning. That's a part of the crisis on the table. So the wrong paradigms are being used to measure progress, right, and the people are the worst for it. Okay. And to go back to your point, not only are they not advancing in consciousness, they are in addition totally overwhelmed by abject, absolute poverty. And so desperation takes the place of rationality in their everyday life.
Well, Professor Adedi, a case of 1 step forward, 2 steps backwards, to use a cliche. I mean, a country, as some suggest, that should be leading with free and fair elections still remains one of the worst performing in that respect. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, it's an assessment. No, not with the way we are. But first, let me just assure Professor OK, that I'm not going to contest yet until I grow up. So shouldn't. Well, you see, back to
drinking.
No, he hasn't actually. Let's be clear. That
okay, you've been drinking on his behalf.
He's very sober. So let's not give the audience the wrong impression.
Yeah, don't mind him. Anyway, just back to your question, right? Yeah, right. I think it's an assessment, like I said, but even with the way we are now, we will be too generous if we think, or if we assess ourselves as maybe scoring an A or a B or a C, in the way we have performed so far in our elections, Not just because of the controversies around the elections, but of course, because of the practical things that we see around it. And we have mentioned it earlier, disenfranchisement, voter apathy, violence, the manipulation of the process, But I also want to believe that if we have to bring any change to this democracy, really, we need our leaders to be largely disruptive. And disruption does not necessarily have to come with a new leader, but the leaders that are presently in power, have to be conscious about disrupting creating some kind of disruption, you know, so that the narrative can change. But sometimes, you know, if they lack the will, the citizens too, you know, have to be galvanized, re-energized, you know, to know that they have some power. And what is this power? The power lies in their ability, you know, to call the leaders, you know, to question, you know, continuously put their feet to fire through the civil society, which has been doing fantastically well, some of them really, in the last couple of years. But of course, we know we need more effort in this direction. Because in the situation where leadership can easily become lethargic, compliant with the system story. Over the years, we've been talking about the same thing. The last 40, 50 years, we've been talking about corruption, we've been talking about nepotism, prebendalism, and all these things, they have continued. Even when those who started these problems, you know, have long gone, we have seen new agencies, new human beings populating the space, you know, furthering the process. So why is this continuity happening? It's just about, you know, how the problematic system, the bad, poor system has been all engaged on account of our inability to subscribe to some salutary values, you know. But for us to disrupt the process, we need a leader that is strong-willed, you know, and of course that can be created at any point in time. And if the leader is not responsive enough, and this leadership may not necessarily be presidential leadership, it could come at different levels, you know. And beyond that, of course, it's also for the citizens to be reawakened, constantly reawakened, you know, not necessarily through dangerous protestation, but of course agitation, some levels of advocacy to remind the leaders of their responsibility compliant with the Leviathan.
Okay, Prof, thank you very much indeed. And sadly, it is at that point that we have to draw a conclusion to this very interesting discussion, because we're going to take you live now to the Bahamas, where the Afrexim Bank is holding its 31st annual general meeting, and it's a very important meeting. That's why we're giving it coverage. Let's listen in. And from all of us here and from my guests on today's program, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Bye-bye.